I see it.
Hey everybody, welcome to Conversations in Pop Culture, and I'm your host, Andrew Davis, and this episode is brought to you by my sponsor, BCW Supplies. Use code POPANIMECOMICS to get 10% off your entire order. Bags and boards are expensive, and you might as well protect your comics in the safest way possible by bagging and boarding them. And I'm not going to bore you with the rest of my sponsors, as I have with me comic creator, writer, and editor, Terry Kavanagh. So welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no, I am very excited because obviously I know some of your work from Marvel. I know a lot of your work from Zenescope, and you've done a lot of stuff between writing and editing and a variety of other things in comics. And I am curious how you got into comics professionally, because you came in sort of right when the Bronze Age was ending, maybe a little bit of the mixture. The Silver Age was sort of still in play and into the modern era. So I'm really curious how you got into comics.
Just a little backstory. I never really planned on getting into comic books. I was a lifelong comic book fan. It was definitely a passion and a hobby of mine. And I grew up with a very supportive family who was constantly telling me all the time that I could be anything when I grew up. I could be president, which sounded vaguely threatening to me because I really didn't want to be president. And it sounded like too much responsibility for an 8-year-old. But so it just never occurred to me to pursue a career in comics. Not that I was against it in any way. I can't explain it. It never crossed my mind. So when I came back to New York from school, I ended up starting out as a truck driver for a ceiling tile, acoustic ceiling tile company, and eventually got promoted to being a salesman for that company, which was almost as horrible as what I imagined being president would be, because I just hated it. I don't think I was a good salesman, and I had no interest in acoustical ceiling tile. Eventually I quit, and I went and I traveled a little. And when I came back to New York, I didn't have a job. And a friend of mine from high school, Michael Higgins, was already working at Marvel at that point as an assistant editor. And one of the other assistants, Ralph Macchio's assistant, Craig Anderson, was going to be out for about 6 months. So they literally, it wasn't the most formal company in the world. And Michael called me up and said, "Oh, you want to come in and be Ralph Macchio's assistant for 6 months?" I'm like, "Sure, I'll try. I don't know anything about it, but I know how to read comics. I don't know any other part of it. I'll do that." I came in, I did that. When his real assistant came back, Marvel made work for me at the time. I was a submissions editor where I shared an office with some of the special projects editors. They just really made work for me until an actual opening came up, which was when Ann Nesenti's assistant, Ann was the editor of the X-Men, her assistant left staff. I think she was moving out of the city. And Ann had seen me around the halls. I had probably dropped off Xeroxes in her office a few times. And again, not the most formal procedure. I was passing by and she said, "Hey, you want to be my new assistant editor?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. It sounded like a little more job security than I had then. And I loved working at Marvel. I was having a great time. All the people were great. They were all people that loved what they did. And it's very rare you get to have a job like that where you're working with people with a shared passion who couldn't be happier. Most of us would have done it just for the free comic books, but we didn't tell them that because, we also wanted to pay our rent and eat. But she offered me the position. I started as her assistant, that was a prestige office at Marvel at the time, the X-Books, so it was a great opportunity for me, not one that I earned. It was just really handed to me on a silver platter. So that's a long way to go to say, when people ask me how you get a job at Marvel, I say go to high school with Michael Higgins. That's really the best advice I can offer.
And even to go further into this, because obviously, and I'm just going to read some titles that you worked on. Obviously, you've done a bunch of Marvel Presents, Namor the Submariner, the Uncanny X-Men, you've gone through Nick Fury, you've done some work on Star Wars. And the one that really I think people know you for is Excalibur. Because a lot of stuff happened with Excalibur. And obviously, one of my favorite people in comics is Scott Lobdell. Scott's been very nice to me. And obviously, you had a lot of fun with Excalibur. And also you gave, from my understanding, I think Alan Davis a lot of freedom to do a lot of cool stuff on Excalibur. So what was this like, and really being the editor on these books?
Look, both those guys, Alan and Scott, deserved everything I offered them. It made my life easier to hire people whose talent I recognized and respected. And not every editor works this way, but my approach was I didn't want to come up with a story every month for the 5 titles I was editing. I wanted to hire someone whose work I enjoyed and respected and then let them go. My philosophy as an editor was to be a shepherd to the characters and basically a butler to the creators and make things work, because you got to juggle different creators. And if the writer comes in late, that puts the penciler a little behind schedule. Monthly periodicals are scary in that way. But when Excalibur was first launched, I was still the assistant editor when it was all being prepared. And then Ann Nesenti left staff right before we were going to release the first issue of Excalibur, at which point I got promoted. I didn't get all the X books, but they kept Excalibur with me because I was working with Alan. Alan was over in England, so it wasn't the kind of relationship that a lot of the people at Marvel knew how to navigate that well, because mostly people came in and went to lunch, and we would go out and we would argue about whether or not Captain America would hit Spider-Man from behind, even if he was possessed. Very loudly, we would argue about these things over drinks at lunchtime. And so that was not the case with Alan. Alan rarely came in. Actually, I don't think I ever met Alan face to face for the first 3 years we worked together. But Alan was the artist and Chris Claremont was the writer. And then when Chris left the book, because of deadline things, he loved the book. He loved working with Alan. When he left the book and I needed a writer, Alan was the first. Alan, I think, had just left the book shortly before that. And I called up Alan right away to ask him if he wanted to come on the book. And there was a little bit of a misunderstanding. I have a lot of family in Ireland, and I would go to Ireland every summer growing up. So I would buy those when I was over there in the UK. I would be able to get these British comic books, the Alan Moore and Alan Davis Captain Britons, the Alan Davis written Captain Britons, and I loved those. They were great. So when I called Alan to come back on the book, he thought I was inviting him to come back on just as the artist. And I actually really wanted him to write and draw it. But really, we didn't communicate for some reason that well in that call. And he's like, no, I don't really want to just come back for that. And he said, anyway, finally he got to who would be writing the book. And he had no intention of coming back no matter what answer I gave, but he was just being respectful to me. And I said, I'm asking you to write the book, Alan. That's what we're talking about here. He was so blown away by that because he didn't know anyone in the United States or at Marvel knew that he had ever written anything in his life. So I wasn't just asking cold. I was asking because this was a talent, a guy whose talent I really respected, and I wanted to be part of that. So that was the offer he couldn't resist. And he'd had enough experience with me. Alan is a very meticulous creator, and he had enough experience with me to trust me that I was going to be able to shepherd the characters and the stories and his work on it. And I think we had a great working relationship, and we're very close friends now. Probably one of my closest friends in the industry.
And even to talk about this, because editing is a tricky business by definition. And it can ruin a book, it can make a book better, and every editor has different styles. And obviously, I come from more of the indie Kickstarter realm, and unfortunately, there's a lot of books that could use an editor, and then there's a bunch of books that also could probably not use an editor. And so this is very tricky, and given that you're one of the guys who's been editing forever in comics, I mean, you have a very unique style, and I know not everybody at Marvel has that style. I know that Denny O'Neil has a particular style, or had a particular style before he passed away. Rest in peace, Denny, and a few other people. So what was that like, even figuring out how to steer a book? Because an editor could have way too much influence, and then it stifles the creation team.
You know, I don't really know how to answer that. I have a suspicion that part of my hands-off approach to editing, and you're right, not everyone did it that way. Part of my hands-off approach to it was some insecurity on my own part. I found it odd that editors were expected to hire writers and shape what the writers were going to do, even though I, at that point, had never written anything in my life. So I just found that odd. It seemed like a reverse expertise that I knew I had a lot more to learn from Chris Claremont when he was writing those titles than he could learn from me. So it seemed presumptuous of me to say, oh, Chris, I think you could do it better this way if you switch this scene, whatever. That changed over time. I don't think I ever became I hope I never became an overbearing editor, but I gained more confidence in my ability, mainly from working with these top tier professionals. I saw what did work best in writing. I saw what did work best in art. There was no training program at Marvel. There was a loose thing called the assistant editors. We had assistant editor meetings, I think, every Wednesday morning. And Tom DeFalco and Mark Gruenwald, two of the best in the business, would give us comics to read beforehand and review, and then they would ask us specific questions. What did you think? Was this scene set up well? Did you care about these characters? So there was a little bit of that going on, but it was more of an apprentice thing as an assistant editor. You watched your editor, and even more importantly, you watched the writer, penciler, inker, letterer, and colorist, and you saw what worked best. And you learned that some things work best for one colorist that don't work for another colorist. And you start to then realize what teams would work best. This colorist might not work with that penciler, or that penciler might not work well with that inker. It's just not complementary to each other. It doesn't mean either have been doing anything wrong. They're just not a good mix together. So as you learn from that, I got more actively involved in my titles on that level of saying, well, I can confidently say that I need an inker with this style to step in, over Alan Davis or over Dave Ross or whoever I was using. And working on Marvel Comics Presents was a crash course in all of this. But it was 2 issues a month. All other comics were once a month. It was 2 issues a month. Each issue had 4 stories in it. So I was dealing with 4 different creative teams twice a month. It was 8 times the amount of creators that any other editor was working with at that point. And most of us had 5 titles, and I had 5 titles, but one of them I had 16 creative teams on a month that I had to work with and juggle. It was stressful as hell. I constantly worried about missing shipping on those titles, and that had a business consequence for Marvel. It made the books returnable if you miss shipping. But it was an opportunity for me to play around with saying, I really want to work with Don McGregor. I asked Don McGregor to come back and do a new Black Panther series for that. There wouldn't have been room for a new Black Panther title. There really wouldn't have been in the Marvel lineup at that point. But I knew I could do any characters I wanted, even obscure characters or characters I loved as a kid. And I could use creators I loved as a kid. I could use legacy creators. And that's a way I could work with new people as well. I remember at one point, Don wanted an extra page for one of his chapters. He had normally 8 pages for each chapter. He had an extra page. He asked if he could get an extra page for it, which meant I would have needed a 7-page story instead of another 8-page story after that. I sort of teased him a little, and I said, because Don Don's a great storyteller in many ways, but he does not skimp on his words when he's writing. And I sort of teased him. I knew he really wanted this. I knew I was going to give it to him, the ability to have an extra page there. And I said, I'll do it, Don, but that means now I have to commission a 7-page story. So you have to write the 7-page story for me, and it has to be a silent story. So I knew that would challenge him. He'd enjoy it. I would enjoy it. And I knew Don was a consummate storyteller and just an excellent writer. So it gave me the opportunity to try out this new artist that was, his samples were showing up in the Punisher office, Jim Lee. So I would never have put an inexperienced artist like Jim with an inexperienced writer, but I had my pick of almost everyone in the industry at that point. So I could put a very experienced writer with an inexperienced artist. And like, for instance, with Scott Lobdell, Scott was very inexperienced. I think I gave him his first story, and nobody in the business worked harder at getting their foot in and getting their first story published. Scott was everywhere all at once. He would be in my office trying to pitch stories to me to get something, and I would excuse myself and I would go down to another office down the hall, and somehow he was in that office too at the same time pitching stories. I don't know how he did it. I think there might have been witchcraft involved, but with Scott, he was inexperienced, and I could take Gene Colan or Don Heck and put them on a story that Scott was doing for me. So I knew if there was a weakness in the inexperienced writer's skill, that an experienced artist could pick up that slack and help with that. So that was an incredible working experience for me.
And I think that's something that's wrong right now with comics in a lot of ways, where there isn't a Marvel Presents in Marvel. There's not something in DC. There are very few major anthologies out there. And it's also when you're building, I guess, your bullpen, for lack of a better word, you need the ability to put experienced people with inexperienced people, so that the inexperienced people get that, I guess, experience, for lack of a better word here. You got to almost build out your talent, and I think that's a big problem right now in comics collectively.
I totally agree with you. I think what the policy is now is to look at independent comics that are getting some attention and letting the creators get their experience in that sector and then bringing them over to the big two, which I think is not a brilliant plan, because the big two should be as innovative as anyone else. And if you're just picking talent, you're not trying anything new or creative, and you're just picking talent that already gained their experience somewhere else, I would worry, if I was in charge, I would worry we're giving away the audience that wants something fresh. We're giving them to the independent sector, and they're avoiding the corporate sector.
I mean, I throw it where WWE with NXT was buying talent, and they actually just changed their policy where they're now homegrown talent. And there was a lot of people in wrestling who were upset. And my response to that was saying, wait a second, this is the next generation, because you're building your superstars and you're building them your way, and you're developing them through an entire system, and you're not necessarily making expensive acquisitions. But, again, I don't run the big two. I don't run any major corporation that buys talent first thing, whatever. But, Major League Baseball is a great example. They have AA, AAA, and they grow their talent in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I think the big two really need to figure out how to do that. But, again, I'm not running those companies yet. So,
and they're now at a point, those companies, that they're operating from a completely different place than we were. Comic books was the main part of Marvel at the time. It's not anymore. Comic books are probably that's what they make the least amount of money on compared to the TV shows and the movies, and they're supported by Disney. So there are completely other demands on the comic books than there was in my day. Although that started before I moved away from Marvel.
Yeah, and then obviously, before we dive into my favorite company, which is Zenescope, I do want to talk a little bit about your Marvel writing stuff, because that came after you were an editor. And I know that you worked on some X-Men stuff, you did some Iron Man stuff, and you did the first Black Cat Limited series.
Okay, I didn't realize it was the first, but yes.
It was 4 issues. I mean, This is like, I like Black Cat. Scott Campbell made me a Black Cat fan. That's all I'm going to say. Hey, he can draw. That guy draws Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy and Black Cat like the best out of anybody.
Oh, he's an incredible talent, and he can story tell as well. It's not just being able to do good figure work. It's not. It's very important in comics to recognize that no matter how beautifully you illustrate, if you can't tell a story, it's not the industry for you. and he can.
But what was this like really though, coming into writing after, you were doing editing work and assistant editing work, and then also going both in and out of editing and writing?
Well, there's more crossover than you think. So what I would do is I'd do my editing job during the day, and we were exempt employees, which meant we didn't have to put in 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. If you could get your job done in 2 hours a day and never miss shipping and put out quality books, that was fine. If it took you 15 hours a day, that's your problem. You're not getting overtime for it. So I would work on my editorial position at the office during the day, and I'd go home and I would write at night. And the way my first writing opportunity came about was, I don't know if you remember the New Universe. The New Universe was, yeah, the New Universe was launched by the editor-in-chief at that time as a different imprint than Marvel. It was, okay, you laugh, I'm going to laugh. It was an attempt to create a slightly more realistic comic book universe. The philosophy was it's the world outside your window. So you weren't going to have Galactus coming down and stepping on New York every 2 years, because honestly, if that happened, nobody would be going to their jobs. Nobody would do anything. It would be a weird world, but that's the conceit you have to accept it at most comic book companies. Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief at the time, wanted to try a different approach. He thought it would be more accessible. He could launch these from the ground up. But they were those titles were very much Jim's babies. And Jim knew exactly what he wanted for those titles, but he couldn't write all of those titles. So how do I put this? Because I have a lot of respect for Jim. There was a lot of friction. People would write perfectly good New Universe comics. It wasn't what Jim saw in his head, and Jim would try to get them to correct it, and it get corrected over and over again. And it was always, it's never going to be possible to produce what's in someone else's head. You just can't do that. There's going to be details that will be missed. It meant books started missing shipping. That reflected badly on those editors. And there were a lot of people who lost their jobs or quit over the New Universe because they weren't fulfilling Jim's vision, or they were feeling overwhelmed by the amount of oversight he was putting on them at that point. And Kickers Inc. was one of the titles, football title. I am not a sports guy. I like football enough, but I didn't know enough about it to really be writing a title. And I think Tom DeFalco was the creator of it. I know he was, actually. And I think he left the title probably over some of the reasons I just said, but he can tell you better than me. And the editor, I'm going to say, asked everybody else in the offices to come on and write that book. And eventually, and everybody's like, nope, not going near the New Universe. Nope, thanks. I'd rather starve. No. And eventually he got to me. I was the new kid around there who hadn't written anything before. And he got to me and asked me, and I'm like, I'll give it a shot. Sure. Why not? What do I have to lose? I did think I was probably going to lose my job over it, but I was young and stupid. And so I did it. And then it led to some toy comics, Animax, I think, that was a licensed comic. Those are always difficult as well because you have to get the approval of your editor. Your editor has to send it to Hasbro to get approval about whatever's going on. Each one at every stage will ask you for changes. Then eventually you'll make the changes. You'll send it to the editor. They'll send it back to Hasbro. At that point, there's a new person in charge of that toy line at Hasbro, and they have totally different ideas. So you were doing a ridiculous amount of revisions on licensed product as well. But again, I didn't have many choices available to me, so I took the opportunities as they came up. And I like to think I developed my skills enough to eventually get offered mainstream Marvel books.
Yeah, and then even speaking about some of this, because one of the things that you're known for, obviously, you had a nice, decent run on Mark Spector, Moon Knight, and that thing is huge now. Yep. And obviously, Moon Knight, thanks to Disney and a variety of other things, is one of those, I guess, comics collectively as a whole that has popped up. And you did some stuff on the Avengers. And then what I think you got a lot of attention for was Maximum Carnage, the 2099 series stuff that you sort of ran through in a lot of ways on a variety of titles, and then working on Spider-Man, and in particular Web of Spider-Man, which is what I think most people know you for, and we're still talking about.
Yes, that's probably true. That's probably
So,
true. Where I thought you were going with this is where everyone goes, which is, what the hell was that clone thing all about? That's what I get from a lot of people. It was, working on Spider-Man was unnerving for me. It really was. It was a flagship Marvel title. I was thrilled to be asked. I loved working with the other creators on those books, DeMatteis and Howard Mackey and Tom DeFalco. That was all great fun. We'd have big editorial meetings, creative meetings, and jump up on desks and demonstrate things we were thinking. Again, I can't stress enough how fun that business was, and I hope still is. But we found ourselves on Spider-Man. We found we'd written ourselves into a corner, which was, when we were reading Spider-Man when we were younger, Spider-Man had to juggle, oh, Aunt May's feeling sick, I have to do homework, I have a date, I also have a cold, and this full face mask is not good for sneezing. And he'd have to juggle that and then throw in an occasional Dr. Octopus. As we creators got married, had kids, bought homes, had mortgages, we literally, I don't know how we didn't notice this sooner, but we wrote the character along with us. And suddenly we were in this position where he was married to Mary Jane, so the sexual tension elements of stories are a little out the window at that point. He's married to Mary Jane. She's the most successful model in town, so they bought a beautiful penthouse apartment, and he was supposed to be the guy who never had any good luck. And now he's the luckiest guy in New York, really. And we just wrote him away from our audience because we took him along with our lives. And he finished school, so he was out of school, so that was less accessible to our target audience, which was, teenagers. So we were batting around different ideas how to deal with that. We talked about if Mary Jane gets killed or if they get divorced. Well, that would have just been more baggage on Peter Parker. Now he's a widower or a divorcee. So we didn't really want to add more baggage. We were trying to get him back to the simpler sort of thing. I remembered from when I was young, the original clone storyline Jerry Conway did, I think, for 2 issues, and I remembered it so clearly because I couldn't have articulated this when I was young. But what was interesting is that a clone of Peter Parker is a good guy because Peter's a good guy. So it was a story about 2 good guys in a bad situation. And it really made you go back and forth on who you're rooting for. You obviously want the Peter that you know and you've been reading about to not lose his life over this. But at the time you thought, oh, this poor other clone guy, he got cloned. He didn't ask for the way he was born. And this is all his memories. And he feels like those are his friends and family. And you could really empathize. And that story ended theoretically with the clone dying. And I remember this also very clearly, that Peter had gotten Dr. Kurt Connors to test to see which one was the clone and which was the real Peter. And then the clone supposedly died, and Peter was swinging across town, and he had the envelope from Kurt Connors, and he ended up thinking, you know what? The way I love Mary Jane, I must be the real one. I can't be a clone. A clone couldn't have this strong a feeling. And he tore up the envelope and threw it away. And when we found ourselves in this position with Spider-Man 20 years later, maybe less than 20 years, I realized that was never really resolved. And what if the clone didn't die? Because, in fact, he was thrown down a smokestack at Con Ed down there, and it's not, as Howard Mackey always likes to say, it's not like there are fires at the bottom of the smokestacks. What if he had come out of there and realized he was a good guy, he didn't want to mess with this other Peter's life, and just took himself off to the West Coast to live a different life? And that put us in a position of, that's a Spider-Man who's single and hasn't finished school yet. So we could get him back organically to the character we thought would be better for our audience. And the plan was, it was 4 Spider-Man titles at the time. think it was supposed to be a 5-month run, so there'd be 20 comics that would tell the story, and in the end, Ben Reilly, the clone, would turn out to be the real Peter, but we'd be able to write the other Peter off into the sunset with a happy ending, because Mary Jane would realize she was pregnant, and they would go off into the sunset to go have the baby, and it even fit organically with Peter's motivation of, with great power comes great responsibility. It was just going to be him adjusting to, all right, my great responsibility now is to my wife and child. That's what I have to do, and I can't risk them by going out and fighting every other animal-themed villain that rolls through town. So that was the plan. We increased sales so much that sales and marketing kept coming to us every other month and saying, you can't end this. It has to go on. And it ended up going on for 2.5 years. We had a very tight outline of how that story was going to go. It got dragged on. There was a lot of padding thrown in the middle. People got pissed off. And then a new editor-in-chief took over, which was Bob Harris. And Bob did not like that ending for the story. He wanted the current Peter to stay as Spider-Man. I don't really know why. Bob's a good friend of mine. I don't think we've ever discussed what his logic there was, because we all knew we needed a single Peter who hadn't finished school, which is why they did the One More Day storyline years later, and they could have just done it organically then. But that was his decision. That he was editor-in-chief. It wasn't up to us, and it just those titles got burdensome. When we did an issue called Send in the Clones, I think it was an annual or something, and there were 200 clones on the cover of Spider-Man that the Jackal released into the wild. I remember thinking, this is the whole thing that'll make this story work, is if they're unique. If Ben Reilly is unique and he has his own life because he's been gone, he's been out there for 20 years. If it's just they're coming off a factory line out like this, then that's not a character anymore. That's just a carbon copy of something. So I really feel it had started going bad before that, but that was the tipping point for me.
But even to talk about this, it's one of the things that I like about this is it's experimenting a lot with, characters. And it's the idea that, Superman's been around forever. Batman's been around forever. Spider-Man's been around for over 60 years now. Captain America's been around even longer than that. Iron Man, I'm not exactly sure how long Iron Man's been around, but I think the point is being made that after a while, you got to reinvent these characters. Yep. And they grow away from their audience. But then also, I'm 29, so I'm still very young in comics, per se, where I came in really in the 2000s. So, but I went backwards. But then there's people who are in their 60s who say, look, I remember when Iron Man was this, and I want those stories too. But then you have a whole new generation. And so what is that like to say, hey, we got to, I guess, repeg our audience, but also keep the audience that has been with us for 20 years? Because it is very tricky to do that. And I don't know if that's an editor's job or a whole team or the CEO or president of whatever comic company is out there doing this, but it's a very complicated issue, I feel. At least in my day, I don't think an editor would have had the ability to say Tony Stark's going to stop being Iron Man and we're going to have Riri Williams. I can't remember her name, but we're going to have a new. I couldn't have just done that willy-nilly without getting approval from the editor-in-chief and the executive editor, Mark and Tom. Understandably, because that's a big, big decision to do. I never understood why it has to be one or the other. And I understand that keeping Tony as Iron Man and calling Riri Iron Girl or something is not quite the same. I get that. But I actually pitched the story to the editor-in-chief at one point of saying, look, we've always talked about how all the years of Marvel comic stories have taken place in 7 or 8 years. That's what we always talk about, was the timeline, even 30 years into it. I pitched the story where we reveal that, and it would involve some retconning because people had started using cell phones, whatever. But you reveal that, yes, all those stories happened in that 8-year period. Call it Marvel Classic. Continue to publish new stories about the Tony Stark, Iron Man, etc. Then cut to the present time, which would have been 25 years later, and call it Marvel Now.
and you'd have the legacy characters of those. It could be Spider-Girl, it could be whoever, and then even do a third imprint of Marvel, the Dark Ages, like what happened in between Marvel Classic and Marvel Now. And I know the editor-in-chief liked the idea. We discussed it and liked it, but it must have gotten shot down by someone above him for legal reasons or toy reasons or who knows what.
You guys were very early, because that's called a crypto split right there.
Yeah.
And when a cryptocurrency has a nice split, and Ethereum is Ethereum, and then Ethereum 2.0 and Ethereum Prescott, it's great. It's right perfectly.
Yeah.
The perfect analogy. This perfect analogy. I love my cryptocurrencies. Full disclosure.
Oh, cool.
Some people might hate me in the comic realm for that. That's okay. I'll take the L on it. But even going further outside of Marvel as well, because the thing is that obviously you left Marvel at some point. I think you took a break from comics, and then you came into Zenescope. And the reason why I bring this up is Zenescope is not a rich history comic company. When you came in, they're less than 20 years old. And I love Zenescope. They're about 17 years old now. And so what was that like coming into Zenescope, and even how that came about? Because you have all this experience as a Marvel editor, and now you're coming into a new company, and that has perks and other, I guess, disadvantages, for lack of a better word.
Well, the perks are that there's not a lot of baggage you have to overcome. So there's a lot of creative freedom involved there, that you're not restricted by some of the things you were restricted by at Marvel. Like we always knew with Spider-Man, you shouldn't do outer space Spider-Man stories. You shouldn't do underwater Atlantis Spider-Man stories. He needs an urban environment. That's what he needs. Doesn't have to be New York, but we knew those things. That was not true of most of the Zenescope characters when I started there. They were still available to be shaped, and I don't remember any restrictions on any particular character where you would say that's out of character for them, because those characters hadn't been established enough that there was something out of character. That was a great perk. That really was. Gave you a lot of creative freedom. And working with Dave Franchini for me was a pleasure. It really was. He was a really good guy, super professional.
He is like the comic intern. He is like right cut out of the cloth of Paul Levin.
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
He didn't come out of comics. He came out of somewhere, and it was almost like an internship that never ended, is how I describe Dave.
Yeah.
And Dave's been on my show, and I love Dave. And Dave, every time I have a brief conversation with Dave, it's always wonderful. But yeah, I mean, you were like editing a bunch of stuff for them, and then a variety of other stuff. And what was that like? Because that's what's so cool about it. I think you did some Spirit Hunters, you did some holiday specials, which I don't know exactly what you played in the holiday specials, but I like those books. They're fun.
I wrote a couple of stories in the holiday specials. I don't think I edited any. I don't think. What was interesting for me, it was a learning curve for me, because with Marvel, we used to work the Marvel style, which was the writer wrote a plot. The plot would go to the artist would break down the pages, then it would go back to the writer to write the dialogue. And DC worked from full script at the time, which was, page 1, panel 1, Clark and Lois are talking at the Daily Planet office. Clark is standing on the left, Lois is standing on the right. Clark is saying this, Lois is saying this. That was a later stage for us at Marvel, where we looked at the art, and then that's what drove the dialogue based on the plot. Zenescope, and I think the whole industry by the time I got back in with Zenescope, was working from full scripts. I had never edited a full script. I had to relearn how to do this. I had a style of editing plots, which was first I read the plot to see, is anyone even going to care about this story? Do you care about the characters? Are there emotional moments? If there are, and there's a good enough reason to continue with that plot, then I would go back in and read the plot again to see if there are any gaping plot holes that didn't make sense. So that was part of my process. That was much tougher for me with the full script, because now I'm stumbling over something's wrong about this scene, but it might have just been the dialogue. It might have been a perfectly valid scene plot-wise, but the dialogue I could have been lost in. Also, they mostly worked with penciler inkers, and I had a same style with at Marvel. We had usually separate penciler inkers. There were exceptions to that, but you could look at the pencils at a certain stage and say, this isn't working, we need an exterior establishing shot, etc. But when you're not actually getting the work until it's already inked, it's all right, now it's tougher to add that establishing exterior shot at the beginning. Or even if you don't like the way a panel looks, you don't know if it's the pencils or the inks. You don't know where it got lost somehow or didn't live up to its full potential. So that was a learning curve for me. I worked hard not to become my grandfather and just bitch about everything that happened after he was 20 years old. I understood this change had happened, and I had to live with it. And it was on me to accept how the new system worked. And so that was good for me because it was challenging and it kept me alert, and it wasn't just falling back into old routines of what I already knew how to do. So, and I was working with a lot of new talent. So we got to learn together along the way. New writers, new artists. I think maybe the colorists were more established than a lot of the artists I was working with in Zenescope.
And then even going further into that, because obviously Zenescope's a very cool company, where they did bring in Howard Mackey for Jasmine, Crown of Kings. They brought in, I think, Hans Riddenoff, I think is his name.
Yes.
He played up the TV. I know Ralph Tedesco, obviously, he's one of the co-founders, and you edited some of his stuff there. And also with Ralph. I don't know if Ralph did Peekaboo or if that was Joe. And I think Ralph might have done Paradise Court.
I think so. Paradise Court, yep.
And so obviously you're editing, your boss's work, for lack of a better word to some degree, as well as Howard Mackey was an old Marvel guy, Hans was TV. And what was that like? Because it's very cool when you're working with professionals and you're working with people who've been around forever and are actually.
Howard and I had a long history of working together as colleagues. We were writers on the Spider-Man books at the same time. As I had hired him to write some of the Ghost Rider features in Marvel Comics Presents. So we had worked together and he had worked for me. I don't think I ever worked for him because I don't think he ever offered me any work. And I'm going to bring that up to him after we get off this call, because Howard and I are very close and we work really, really, really well together. We make a good team. He can bounce ideas off of me. I respect what he's thrown out there. He respects what I throw back. That was great. I was a little more worried about working with Ralph and Joe because they were the owners of the company and they didn't necessarily have to listen to me. They really didn't. But that was not my experience. They were receptive. Everybody was receptive to learning. And even all the artists, all the colorists, I had to adjust to the way coloring had changed in comic books in the years I had been gone, and I had to learn that. So a lot of changes I would sometimes ask for from colorists, they would come back at me and say, well, I don't think it's going to work for that reason, because when it goes to the trade paperback, etc. So again, I got to learn along the way. And what I noticed with Ralph, I think it was or maybe it was Ralph, I think. These guys plan a lot of their works hoping it gets picked up by other mediums. And, movies or TV shows, they had.
Van Helsing is a good example of that.
Yeah, they had that. And that's a part of the goal of that company. And that's a perfectly valid goal. And every comic book company is doing that on some level. They're a little more upfront about that, or they were with me at least. But what it led to was there was one title I was editing that I think Ralph wrote, and he had a really extended car chase scene in it. It was like 6 or 7 pages. And I had to get on the phone with him and say, car chase scenes don't work in a comic book. It's a static medium. And you're never going to get that sense of, they almost hit that old lady who was crossing the street, or, the guys behind are catching up. You're never going to be able to capture that the way you can on a TV screen or a movie screen in a comic book. And so I really suggested he cut back on that. There were a million other dramatic moments we could have added before or after that I think would work. And he listened. He heard that and listened. And it didn't mean he can't have a really extended car chase scene if that comic book gets adapted into a movie or a TV show. But there are ways you should write differently for a static medium than you do for, TV or movies. And they were totally open to hearing all of that. Listening.
And I think it's the idea that, and it's a hard skill to learn, is shut up and listen. Shut up and listen is a very hard skill to learn. And also it depends on who's saying it. If my friend is telling me and giving me advice, it's different than a complete stranger who has no say in what I'm doing and is trying to offer a friendly suggestion or even an opinion versus somebody who's an expert in a certain sector. So that's something. And then obviously you edited one of my favorite books is Hellchild Blood Money. And I just love Hellchild. I just love her entire thing and everything. And I think that she's a better Van Helsing, but don't tell Ralph that.
Okay, I won't.
No, I just love the way she looks. And then what were you saying?
She's a great visual. She really is very unique.
Amazing, and I'm hoping that eventually, I think they're doing Karis next as a statue, and then I hope we get Alice, and then I hope we get Hellchild, because Hellchild is something else in a lot of ways, and I love the way she's utilized in the entire universe, because she could do things that Van Helsing can't, but you get that Van Helsing vibe. But I digress right there. But I do want to dive into what you've written, because you've shaped several characters. Obviously, the Three Musketeers, you worked on that.
Yep.
And then you also did the Black Knight, which is a fascinating character as well. And some of those trading cards are going to be out soon off their Kickstarter. And they're going to be fun. And they did Oz Heart of Magic. And that's another one that's super cool. And obviously the Oz stuff is very fun, because Zenescope obviously has Wonderland, they have Neverland, they have Oz. And so what was that like, really getting to shape Oz? Because I think that's what a lot of people know you for as well.
That was really interesting, because there was the advantage, in a sense, of never having to face a blank page. There was a rich history to draw from, but it wasn't baggage that we were constrained by, because I could look up stuff about the Oz books. I reread a few of them during that, and stumbled on characters like Talos and stuff that had not been used in these, and I could use them in any way I wanted. I didn't have to use them the exact same way they were used in the original L. Frank Baum books. I was able to take something and develop it in a different direction, but it was still part of the very rich mythology of those books. That was fascinating for me. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's Oz, and I mean, everybody knows it too, and that's the other thing too that I think is very cool about Zenescope, is that you come into Zenescope, I mean, people know the Three Musketeers, people know Oz, they know Wonderland, and so if you're passing by at a con and somebody has an Oz book, they're going to be more receptive to it because they already are familiar with it. But then there's also stuff that Zenescope kind of shakes it up on its head a little bit. And so that's something that I think really helps actually convert fans over with Zenescope, is they're familiar with certain aspects of that product.
I think that's the most brilliant element of their business model. It really is. They took characters that we have a certain comfort level with, and that also can lead to a curiosity about. Like, oh, I read Robin Hood when I was younger. What's up with Robin Hood now? Now you're not getting the Robin Hood that you read about when you were younger.
Well, what's up with this attractive Robin Hood who has a nice rack? This is intriguing, isn't it?
Yes. And you're getting a more modern take on it. I think that's fun. That's the kind of books I like to read, stories I like to watch on TV. That's real interesting when people take something and, like you said, turn it on its head.
And even going further into that, because one of the things that, I don't know how much you follow Zenescope as a guest collector or as an investor, as my title says, but they do a lot of variant covers. And that's the other thing that's very cool, because these books didn't just come out as graphic novels. They came out as single issues. And in the process, and I don't know every single issue and every single cover artist who's done it, but it's not unreasonable that Keith Garvey has done covers with your stories on them or in them. I think Senka Manaki's done some stuff. I think there's a Paul Green or two out there. And all of these artists have a big following. And the company obviously had to pay the artists for their artwork to put on the cover. They had to print the books. They had to sell the books. And so all these people have your books, whether they have it for the art or for the story or for both. What is that like for you? Because that's another brilliant thing that Zenescope has done.
I totally agree. That's brilliant. And I will tell you this, that was one of the adjustments for me, even as an editor for Zenescope. At Marvel, the editor was responsible for the covers. I had nothing to do with the covers at Zenescope. That was all Dave. So I would be editing all the interior of a title. I would have no idea what the covers were going to look like. And he'd get 8, 10, however many different covers. And I wouldn't see them till they showed up in the mail at my house, those comic books. It was a separate part of their business model that they had an entire part of Dave dedicated to, because I think they understood covers are what sell books. People can't, and the art sells it as well. People can't pick up a comic book in the comic book store and decide if they like the writing or not, because they don't know till they take it home and read it and oh, that story was fun, I like that. They're never going to be able to pick out in the store that way. They can pick it out based on the art. They can look and say, oh, I like this art. They may take it home and hate the story and not come back for that. And that art might not bring them back all the time. But the other side of that is bad art can turn somebody off right away. It could be a brilliant writer in there, but if they pick it up and it looks ugly, or if it looks ugly to them in their subjective opinion, they'll just put it back and they're never going to know how great that story was. But if you focus on those covers and make sure those covers are intriguing enough, and I would argue that's what you have to do, not just pinup shots. And they didn't do just pinup shots at Zenescope. There were certainly many of the variant covers were that, but there were also scene covers. There were covers with scenes that make you want to know what's going on inside there. How did the character get to this point that we're seeing on the cover, where a werewolf is halfway swallowed her leg, whatever. I made that up, but I'm sure that happened.
It's super interesting because they usually do, if it's a smaller book that's like a 3-parter, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 covers. But then if you get into something like Grim Fairy Tales or Tales of Terrors or a Robin Hood series or The Black Knight, they have all of these. They have about 4 covers. So cover A is sort of what's in the book, I feel. Cover B might be, more of an action scene. Cover C is usually the pinup shot. And then cover D is the Wild West, where it's anything they want. They also do blank covers. And then they go into all these other type of covers too, where they have 250 limited print runs, 350 print runs, 500 print runs, nude covers, showcases, medals, galleries. And so it's very interesting, and it's also very cool, and it's very smart because I have a lot of Zenescope stuff, and also the books go up in value and they're a tradable commodity, which is a whole nother element of their business. And they know exactly what everybody does with their books. Just go on eBay, guys, and there's certain books that go for $300-$400 for a reason.
Wow.
So what is that like? Because that's not, certain Marvel books do that too now, but that is a very new concept. And given that you've been around in this industry, I think for a little shy of 40 years, give or take, what is that like for you? Because that's a new phenomenon. That is not,
it is. And I'll tell you, you clearly know more about how the covers at Zenescope were done than I did, because like I told you, I had nothing to do with those. And it was an alarming concept to me when I first started with Zenescope. And I'll tell you why. We started doing variant covers with like Spider-Man #1 that Todd McFarlane did, the adjectiveless Spider-Man, and X-Men. I don't know if we started them then, but we definitely did them for those titles. And those titles sold tremendously. I think X-Men #1 sold 8 million copies. Spider-Man #1 sold 3 million copies. That does not mean by any means we had 3 million people reading Spider-Man or 8 million reading X-Men. What it meant was if there were 10 variant copies, well, a Spider-Man fan now had to buy 10 copies of the same issue of Spider-Man. And if they did that, since most of them were on fixed incomes, being their allowance, most of the fans back then, if they had to buy 10 copies of Spider-Man that month, it might have meant they couldn't buy Iron Man. It might have meant they couldn't buy Doctor Strange or Iron Man or one of the other titles. And you never want to give a fan a reason to miss an issue, because then they realize, oh, I didn't get Iron Man last month and I lived. I survived that, so I don't have to spend money on Iron Man. You never want to give them a jumping off point. And I feel like that's what happened. Was Ron Perlman had bought Marvel at that time, and there was a much more corporate mentality that came into play. I think he wanted to use, well, I can't speak for him, but I think he wanted to use Marvel to pay off his Revlon debt. And so there was this move to start playing as speculators as opposed to fans. And maybe I'm talking to the wrong person here, since it does say the investor, Andrew Davis.
Hey, it's a science. It is a science. And there's a difference between over speculation with what happened in the 90s and the idea of healthy speculation.
It also sadly, there were these people buying 10 copies of each of the 10 covers. So they buy 100 copies of Spider-Man 1 or X-Men 1 with the expectation they could then use those to put their kids through college later on. Well, in fact, those are the least expensive comics in the aftermarket, because there are 8 million and 3 million of them out there. So they're way less valuable now than, so we literally started to play to speculators in a way that I feel like we were misleading these people, because there was a value to an X-Men #1 if you had an original X-Men #1 way back when. But if there are 8 million of them out there now, there's never going to be a value to that in the aftermarket.
And that's one of the things with Zenescope. It's so low print runs by definition. Mm-hmm. And it's also the idea that, I play and openly, and people know me. I've been on talking about this on their virtual account a while back, is I like to play with their 350 print runs and their 250 print runs or their 375 print runs, because there's only 375 of those books out there. Yeah. So even if that book has a natural built-in value, because it's limited, when you have an unlimited run and you have 100,000 of a copy of a book, it's complicated. Now, I think over time, everything now is more or less limited. But give a good example that's not Marvel but DC. Action 1000, very few of them are valuable because of the normal covers and even some of the Virgin covers. They were printed in so many that if there's 40,000 copies of a book, it's really hard for it to become a valuable entity. But I digress.
Yeah, back when I was on staff at Marvel, we canceled titles that sold less than 100,000 copies a month. If it was 90,000, it wasn't worth continuing. We try to make room for something else. Now, I think people would be thrilled with 50,000 copies of something selling.
Yeah. I also think it's now the idea, because I was just on somebody's show talking about this as a guest, where it's also what type of client you want. And I think there's a lot of questions that, Marvel and DC and every even indie creator needs to ask. And even Zenescope, I think, has sort of answered this, because the people who spend money at Zenescope, I know people who spend $300 to $400 a month on Zenescope every single month, live on a virtual live stream. Those are the type of clients you want. So you don't need a big audience if you have an expensive audience. Yeah. Versus the idea that if you're Marvel or DC, what they really want is they want somebody spending $200 every single month on DC Comics, because now you have a very good business, because you have a high-end client, and then you want that high-end client to continuously make more money, and naturally it will come into your company. But this is not business hour. That's in 30 minutes, guys. I don't have a business show yet. Someday, CNBC, if they want to call me, I'll do alternative investing all day. put me right before Jim Cramer, oh my God, I will have a field day. And it will. I'll wear the suit. I'll wear suspenders. It'll be great. I'm just saying. I will steal a set too. Absolutely. Um, but I don't want to keep you from enjoying your drink in New Orleans. And we've been talking for a while. I got one more question that I'm going to give you a chance to self promote. And I'm very curious. But where do you foresee the future of comics going? Because you've been in the industry for a while. You went through Marvel. You saw a variety of changes through the late 80s, 90s, and into a little bit of the 2000s. Obviously, doing a lot of work for Zenescope. And where do you see it going now, I guess, in through the COVID era and past the COVID era, for lack of a better word?
That's a very interesting question, and I probably would have answered it differently an hour ago than I will now, because I just learned a lot from you about Zenescope and how they are appealing successfully to investors like yourself, and how they're intentionally going about that. What I would have said an hour ago is that comic books still only exist as R&D for movies and TV. It's a cheap way to explore a character or a storyline or something. I think that's why Disney keeps Marvel Comics alive. I think that's why Warner Brothers was keeping DC alive. But now what I'm hearing from you is something interesting about other business models that can keep them alive just as publishing imprints. And that makes me feel a lot better about the industry, to tell you the truth.
Well, I'm glad that I can shift minds. I'm going to drop something for those who know, and when people see this in the future, October 5th. I'm not going to go into any details, but let's just say that it's going on something that's in my name, and relative to that, there's a reason why I'm dropping October 5th. If you look at the Comic-Con schedule, there is a prominent con that's coming out. It's a whole marketing thing, but I'll be talking about that in 2 weeks on somebody else's show. But I do want to give you a chance to self-promote, because obviously we've been speaking about comics, Zenescope, Marvel, and a variety of other things. I could have easily gone on for another 3 hours, but you have a friend and a drink waiting somewhere for you. So I do want to give you a chance. Where can people find you, bother you, hit you up, buy your merchandise, find you at a convention if you go to them, and anything of that nature?
Well, I am going to the Terrificon convention. I am a guest there at Mohegan Sun, July 29th, 30th, and 31st, up at Mohegan Sun up in I don't even know, New York or Connecticut. Oh, it's Connecticut.
Connecticut. It's Connecticut. Yeah. It's a beautiful casino.
Yo, I love it.
I'm
very excited about it. Yep. And
I'm
also,
a Connecticut native, guys. I might be there.
Cool. Come say hi. Howard Mackey and I have started a company called Inksmith, Inksmyth. You can find us at inksmith.com. We do custom comic books as high-end gifts for people. Basically, what we do is, usually the client is not the same as the subject of the comic book. So the client will hire us. We'll talk to the client about what are the subject's strengths, and we'll turn that into a superhero power set and a costume and an identity. What are the hurdles, the obstacles they've overcome in their life, and we'll turn that into a villain or some kind of antagonistic something in the story. And so it's not a biography of their lives, but it speaks to their lives and how their lives have developed and what makes them a hero to the people in their lives, and what were the obstacles and hurdles they had to overcome along the way. And we throw in a lot of Easter eggs that are real mentions of, their cousins or anything like that are hidden in there. People seem to really enjoy it. We've done quite a few of them at this point, but you can check us out at inksmyth.com, INKSMYTH.com.
And then obviously, I'm going to keep saying this, is that you have to support indie comic creators. Excuse me. And what that means is you have to follow them on social media. You actually have to buy their books. You have to buy the books they edited, worked on, wrote, artistry. If they have Kickstarters or crowdfunders, got to go support that as well. And that's a big thing. And also you got to follow them on social media. And if they're running businesses, you got to actually look at their businesses and buy their products off of their businesses, because it goes a long way.
Yep.
And so I really recommend everybody check that out and do all those things, because it goes a long way. And if you're at a con, obviously go up to somebody's booth and buy what they're selling. I'm sure that, you're happy to sign anything for anybody when they buy stuff. And I'm sure you also have some cool stuff at your booth that you may or may not be able to get. Some Zenescope stuff you're going to be going through tonight, I promise. Seeing what's valuable, that you're going to reprice the entire thing, But I digress on that. But it is very important to support people and actually purchase directly from them or their websites, because it does go a long way and it does help tremendously. Again, obviously, since we're talking about comics, please use my code. It is 10% off your entire order. At BCW Supplies, use Pop Anime Comics at checkout. Get 10% off your order, because bags and boards are expensive. Inflation sucks. And if you can save yourself some money, you might as well do it. And on that note, I'm going to give you the final word.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure, and you taught me things I didn't know.
Well, I am always glad to teach people things. And on that note, everybody, that is a wrap.